Hello and welcome to the Dingometer with myself and Phil Gomm, Director of Learning Experiences at Ding Learning. Phil, welcome.
Hello, hello. I know you've got a bit of a frog in your throat, so if you go on mute, I know that you're actually coughing your lungs up. Is that right?
That's right, yes. If I hand over to you very rapidly, then you know why.
It's not like a pregnant pause for significance and to build tension. It's the fact that you're struggling for breath. Is that right?
That's exactly, yeah. But I'll put myself on mute, so it's fine.
Good to know. If you actually turn the screen off, I know it's getting really bad.
It's getting really bad.
Mhm.
Okay, welcome all. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the arts of teaching excellence, how to improve teaching excellence in your institution. So, very brief context to this. Phil and I run a consultancy called Ding Learning. We build courses for people, and we've done a lot of work in the last 18 months around the idea of employability. But what's happened through this investigation and through the work that we've done is we've uncovered lots of, I suppose, related facts around teaching, learning design. And we thought, well, these investigations has led us towards this idea of teaching excellence. What is it and how is it changing? And perhaps how do we need to rethink the definition of teaching excellence in light of current trends, particularly around things like AI? So the focus of this webinar is really just to provide some practical advice around what teaching excellence is, how it might be changing, and how rethinking it might be useful to you, perhaps particularly in tackling some of the weather that you're facing in your own institution. So this broadly is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at the skills gap and why there is a skills gap, why it persists, and why employers are continually frustrated with the lack of apparent skills that graduates have. We're going to be digging into that a little bit. We'll be sharing 4 core attributes that we believe are essential for 21st century professional success. And this is born out of all the work that we've done around building apprenticeships, building HE courses, short courses, around closing this skills gap. So focusing on what actually matters in learning experiences. And then we'll work through and share some practical approaches to designing learning experiences that will help you move the needle in your professional context. Phil, anything to add before we move on?
I just want to be very transparent, actually, at the beginning and say that one of the reasons why we are talking into this space and why we want to do it is born of something as human as frustration in some respects and some impatience, I would say, because Tony and I have both been course leaders and in that time, our relationship and understanding of metrics around employability, retention, student experience, all of those things, that experience builds out fluency and literacies around thinking about learning as being this thing where there's all these stakeholders, right? Which is a term I don't really like, but it's the term that, you've got all these stakeholders, and all these stakeholders have expectations around the learning experience. And if you've been in that sort of space for a long time, you can start to experience interesting cross currents and frustrations around the goal and the purpose and the mission of learning. And sometimes it can get very binaried, and you can end up having to pick a side, and you can end up in sort of this dichotomy. And one of the things that's become really clear since Tony and I have left is that binary is deeply unhelpful, simply because at the end of the day, a lot of people are putting their shoulders to the goal of trying to do something right, trying to appease all of the stakeholders. And it just seems it's very easy to fall into sort of fiefdoms when it comes to education, higher ed, employability. And I'm just not interested in that. And I'm going to be very honest about that. I'm just not interested about that because I think a lot of people's personal identities align with it. Like you end up picking a side, and it becomes kind of important to you what side you are on. And I get all of that too. But because we've had to work very pragmatically and work outside of our own specific comfort zones, and we've now sort of been outside of the walls of HE for long enough to realize that there is value in looking in and sort of shining out. And so partly what this is about is trying to bring some of that to this webinar and to the space, in a sense. So to try and take the binaries away, because they're effectively unhelpful and they're quite frustrating intellectually if you're around those conversations for as long as we've been, really.
Yeah, totally agree. So we thought it would be useful to start with defining some key terms. So teaching excellence, a term that's widely used, particularly in higher education, but usually in any environment that involves teaching. And it's often understood as the practice of facilitating learning through exceptional instructional methods, deep subject knowledge, and transformative educational experiences. So really focusing on this idea of excellent teaching. And it's characterized by things like the ability to inspire intellectual curiosity or critical thinking, and develop this idea of mastery and practical capabilities. So that's often, there are other ways of defining teaching excellence, but we thought that was quite a useful way to start.
I would say about this definition is where teachers or educators would see their excellence. That notion that their job is to inspire intellectual curiosity, to foster critical thinking. So I think that when a lot of educators, people who live to sort of transform and move the needle in others, that they would recognize themselves very much in this definition, because that feels like the work, that feels like the job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, yeah, and then you have teaching excellence as a kind of another space, which is a sort of a more of a bureaucratic regulatory definition. So you have teaching excellence as an assessment mechanism, introduced into UK higher education to evaluate. So this is where the culture of metrics derives from. So it's where teaching excellence starts to be aligned with these slightly sort of third-party stakeholder ideas. So student satisfaction, which should be a simple enough idea. I think a lot of teachers and educators live to produce student satisfaction, but student satisfaction now lives with particular characterizations and definitions and particular functions in institutions. It also pertains to graduate outcomes and continuation rates. And in this sense of teaching excellence, it's designed to produce a very particular effect around market accountability. It is used as a kind of receipt of value for money. It is there as a term to justify tuition-free structures, because essentially, if your teaching isn't excellent, then you are not receiving value for money. So teaching excellence absolutely here comes into being and exerts an influence that's absolutely connected to sort of the consumer view of learning and the sort of the service industry view of universities, and that's where all the stakeholder and all the metrics and all that kind of all those cross currents that Tony and I are incredibly familiar with, and very empathic around in terms of sort of like educators working within this framework. This is what teaching excellence has come to me, and this is why it's no longer an easy term to talk about, because it's actually a term that's fallen into disrepute in so many ways.
Yeah, and it's also not a neutral term. This idea, it is, as you say, it's politicized, and it's very clearly linked to core metrics underpinning the annual assessment, the Teaching Excellence Framework assessment. So we have these core metrics around student experience, so teaching on my course and the quality of that, assessment and feedback, and academic support. And then we have other student outcomes, such as things like non-continuation rates as a measure of teaching excellence, or employment or further study as a measure of teaching excellence. But the key thing here is this statement at the bottom, where the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework, assumes this idea of correlation equals causation, that achieving excellence in teaching leads to better employment outcomes. So that is a strong statement.
And again, I just want to say about that this is a classic example where I don't really believe in the Darth Vader model of sort of them versus us. In other words, I think you can talk to a lot of academics and sort of people on the front line, and they can feel very done unto. But this notion that your education experience should be excellent is not an unreasonable expression. I think that's what everybody could agree around that. And the other thing that I don't think is unreasonable is the idea that that sort of excellence, this extraordinary, educational journey, should produce sort of sufficient Velcro for you to stick to a job in a way that's kind of quite sort of clear and sort of obvious and good. But the problem is, I think, which the next slide will reveal, is that even if you get because the TEF works with badges, you get a bronze one or a silver one, or a gold one. That even if you have like these extraordinary achievements, these sort of baubles that speak to that you've met these tick boxes and you're doing all that you should do, it should no longer be true, therefore, that the employability gap, the skills gap, should be sort of diminished by the TEF. It should be sort of like a shrinking gap. But the data suggests that that gap is stubbornly wide, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we won't read all these out, but there's persistent reports or consistent reports around this idea of a skills gap. So graduates, only 52% of graduates feel well prepared, but also so graduates are frustrated because they don't feel prepared, but also employers are frustrated because they just expect graduates to be more employable, and yet they seem not to be. And there's some other interesting data that comes out around this idea of graduates knowing lots of things but not being able to put that into practice. So there's clearly something here. There is a gap between graduation and employment that is not being addressed, despite, as you were saying, Phil, the fact that loads of people are really working really hard to nail and to close this employability gap.
And also that the TEF exists to the TEF exists to meet concerns that the value for money is entirely aligned with employability. And of course, that's a big nuanced discussion there. It's a discussion for another time. There's another reason why teaching excellence and employability are terms that are themselves a big turn-off for lots of people. So they're not, in fact, helpful. So if you were to say to a group of kind of people, hey, we need to dial up the employability and we need to dial up your teaching excellence, you've lost them already, because what they actually hear is a sort of like a neoliberal siren going off in their heads about why they need to sort of like put their shoulder to the cog,
work harder, yeah,
and move this machine. So one of the things that we want to talk about too is the problem, and we're talking about it a lot already, the problem of language as being a sort of a way in which thinking goes to die, and employability is another one of those things. So what we've got here is a version of employability as perhaps could it be written by the employer. So when the employer thinks about what they mean and want from someone who is employable, this is the definition that they might write for themselves, which is the possession of job-ready skills and those workplace competencies that allow new graduates to contribute productively with minimal additional training. And that's very, very key, because the idea is that a lot of employers are frustrated and puzzled by sort of the university experience, because they are confused as to why they have to then spend more time and their own money teaching into a space that was meant to be taken care of by this thing that took 3 years and all this money over there. So that notion of the additional training and the time and the burden of onboarding and getting people up to and acculturating people into workplace competencies, all of that is where a lot of that frustration lives. So, they want those technical abilities, they want professional comportment, that they know how to sort of, their demeanor, they have a workplace demeanor that sort of like has fluency, and they want those practical experiences. So I think that if you were to ask the employers to write a definition for employability, it would look a little bit like this.
Something like this. And yet, like you say, there is other people will interpret employability very differently. So this is much more of a neoliberal sort of critique of employability, this idea of a reductive recasting of higher education's purpose towards market utility. So if you have anything to do with higher education or education over the last 20 years, you'll be aware of this sort of frustration around the overarching purpose of higher education particularly. Is it about employability, or is it about knowledge for knowledge's sake? So this idea of employability is often perceived as a kind of a neoliberal construct that in some ways subordinates intellectual development and critical thinking, because it's more about preparing students for work, and that is the overarching project of higher education. So it also produces sort of this resistance, this negative connotation.
And I would say the reason why it produces that resistance is because depending which middle manager you have, and depending who's looking after you, and depending who's in charge of briefing those national student survey sessions, all of those things, that it can feel and will feel that you are in a reductive exercise, that everybody is so worried about their sort of performance related metrics, that it can feel that sort of the fact that you spent like the previous week switching light bulbs on in the minds of young people or whatever it is, or doing extraordinary transformative things, if it didn't add up to this measurable thing that produces a measurable job. None of that actually happened in
Pointless.
affairs. And so I absolutely, and I just want to restate that I have lived experience of exactly the disappointments and the frustrations and the sort of the failures of leadership and management that encourage you to have encouraged me perhaps to think of employability as the least interesting possible output of an exciting HE program. That employability starts to feel as if like it's the antichrist, it's the enemy, it's kind of like the antagonist of everything that's going on. But I will also say that in my role as a course leader, I knew that could not be true. I knew that binary that was popular and sort of like politicized, it felt like it forgot one important thing, and that was it forgot the young person, who was in my care and in the care of my staff, who had hopes and aspirations that looked very much like employability.
Yeah.
So I myself always felt like I had ants in my pants, if you like, around employability and metrics, because I could see it in both ways, and that sort of that made it sort of an interesting space to talk about and think about. So
yeah, very much so. So we've done quite a lot of work, haven't we, in the last 18 months to 2 years around employability?
Well, we've worked in lots of places now. We've worked in sectors and around kind of subjects that are not part of our own sort of like sort of legacy of teaching. And when we set the business up, we said yes to lots of interesting free range work. And what's been fascinating about the eclecticism, and what's been fascinating about how sort of out there some of the work has been how similar and the commonalities, the story beats, the rhyming schemes of the problems we've been seeking to solve, the problems that have been brought to us as kind of slightly like perhaps generalized universal feelings of dissatisfaction with X and Y. It's been our job to understand the primary colors of those problems, and those primary colors have been incredibly consistent in regards to what people are crying out for. Can you solve this skills gap? Can you help close the gap between graduates and this thing? Can you sort of, there's this gap. And so the next sort of run of slides is our attempt to kind of share with you the names of those primary colors, the things that come up over and over again in all of these very different sorts of disciplinary areas that we've been working in.
So yeah, so as you said, there are some core themes that have come out of this work, whether it's been apprenticeships or short courses or higher ed courses or any kind of learning experience that has its ultimate outcome with something to do with employment. And they are things like adaptability. We want students to be adaptable and be able to respond effectively in new situations. We want them to be proactive and use their initiative. They must be able to be self-starters. They must be able to sort of get on with it and not require too much hand-holding and just sort of get started quickly. We need them to be accountable. So we need them to take ownership of their work and make sure that they take responsibility for maintaining high standards and also for their own currency, so that they're not just arriving and expecting to be just sort of looked after. It's that they have to own their own development. And also critical thinking. So this idea that they are able to not just take things at face value, but actually understand the needs of themselves, the needs of the team, the needs of the manager, and also the needs of the wider business, which is, it's quite a big ask for a new graduate. But these are often the things that if effective job readiness involves from the employer's point of view. So these are the things that are often asked for through these courses.
I think if you're listening to that, none of those four like cries for help are going to come as in any way as a surprise. When I was sort of teaching and delivering and sort of reframing and rewriting briefs, these are the conversations that I was having with myself and with others. It's about how you could generate more of these things. But I think it's just fascinating that in all the conversations we've had, and yes, people use different synonyms for these things. People don't always ask for critical thinking, but they often, the clients we work with, use a lot of words that mean this.
Yeah,
They're
project
just
management.
always describing. And the thing that I've always found frustrating is that these are often lumped in the bucket called soft skills. And I honestly have said this before, and I'll say it again. If these skills were so soft, then why is it that they are increasingly expressed and positioned in our experience as being absolute game changers, like not soft, but sort of leading the charge, the vanguard of employability, like the hardest piece of armor that you can give a student. If you're going to sort of imagine a student as a Swiss Army knife, that the implement that they use the most are these four things,
Yeah.
these four sharp-ended precision instruments. These are not soft skills, and yet so often they are expressed as soft skills, even in the language of the frustrated employer. We'll talk about they need more soft skills, and if you dial into that, you realize that that in itself, from a language point of view, is helping to reproduce the disappearance of those important attributes. And it becomes even more important for this reason. And I'm sure nobody needs any more content on LinkedIn or anywhere about AI, but we're going to have to deal with it a bit, right, Tony? We're going to have to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is we thought the pandemic was going to be the biggest thing that happened probably in our lifetime. And then suddenly 3 years later, here we are with AI. So yeah, and unsurprisingly, there's an awful lot of rhetoric around the impact of AI and the real impact of AI on jobs in all sectors, and the fact that jobs will change in the next 5 years. I mean, I would argue that you could go back pre-pandemic and say that these things were still being said then, but AI is just really just accelerating that trend. And producing huge disruption in sectors, but it is absolutely driving the need for these skills, to people to be adaptable, people to be proactive, people to take ownership of their own learning, so that they can develop themselves and keep up to date quickly. So this has produced sort of a set of attributes around this, things like versatility. So the learners who can, and this doesn't necessarily mean graduates particularly, this means anyone in a business, anyone who can adapt and thrive in the diverse, complex situations they find themselves in teams. They need to be creative to be able to have ideas. They need to be able to pull together knowledge from across their own business, but also increasingly from outside their business, to see how their business or how their work might intersect with other professional disciplines.
I
And
mean,
crucially,
what you're looking at here,
oh,
sorry,
sorry.
what we're looking at here is these are attributes, which are the attributes which um, outlive or transcend. They're sort of meta-cognitive attributes that AI itself cannot muster. So again, just as we spent some time with the many conversations we've had with employers where they were crying out for these soft skills, and we were able to sort of like characterize them as proactivity. In all the conversations and all the research and learning around AI and the effect it's having on knowledge, what is the difference between machine learning and human learning, and all of those things, that these four traits, these four spaces, these dimensions of human behavior, of human potential, are the ones that kind of, yeah, that, you could swap out versatility for another word, but this is an attempt to sort of arrive at the four primary colors, if you like, of human capacity that sort of transcend machine learning in that way. Whether you're in a business, whether you're whoever you are, this is sort of like those sort of universal. These are universal dimensions of what it is to sort of be us right now.
Yeah, that's right, and particularly ethical reasoning. Then that last one there, AI can give you all sorts of content about all sorts of things very quickly to a very high standard often, but it cannot make a decision as to what is the right thing to do, because ultimately that is up to us to decide. So ethical reasoning in the face of a torrent of information and knowledge and content becomes an absolutely intrinsic skill, an intrinsically important skill in terms of how you navigate that, how you choose and select and edit, and what you choose to foreground and leave out. Increasingly, that these are ethical decisions.
So what we did, because we were interested in, is that it was very obvious to me from a sort of like a rhyming scheme, from a cadence point of view. And you get very good when you're a consultant and you're in that space and you really are trying to listen. You really are trying to help. You have to have develop an incredibly fine-tuned ear for cadence, and to see rhyming schemes and what people are talking about. And so I was very interested in this, and so I was very interested in the what seemed to me to be kind of like the resemblances, the family resemblances between the sort of the four things that sort of employers were always saying defined the skills gap by dint of them being missing from people. And then the skills that were absolutely sort of required, the dimensions of human potential that in a sort of AI augmented space become increasingly kind of valuable and important and sort of irreducible. And so you sort of have, so what we did is we sort of put them together and wondered if there was a final flourish, like a chef's kiss, where you could actually finally find a top level attribute that meant all of those things. And this was the work you're seeing here. So where adaptability and versatility sort of live, that you're looking at a sort of a dimension of agility. You're looking at agility as an attribute, and you can read what's on the screen, so I don't need to. So we arrived at agility, innovation, holistic problem solving, and principled action being target attributes for 21st century learners, because it would achieve either two things or indeed the same thing. It would achieve employability, that notion of the skills that are required for their professional comportment and to sort of be successful in your own right in the workplace. And then there is this other win, which is that these attributes enable you to be confident and to co-author your life with AI in a way that doesn't feel as if you are being kind of driven over by the Terminator, for example, right? So we were sort of, we arrived at these target attributes for 21st century learners. And because we arrived at those 21st century attributes, we were then able, I think, to start thinking about what we wanted to mean by terms like employability. So for us, if you think about employability not as that sort of neoliberal, reductionist, metric Trojan horse, the stick that beats educators with. If you think about employability as being a expansive, important sort of like space, then you arrive at something like this. So this is where we got to, that employability to mean the capacity to apply and adapt knowledge effectively in variable contexts, the possession of fundamental attributes that enable individuals to mobilize their knowledge in response to uncertainty. And some of the key things here was just admitting to the fact that uncertainty, variance, the ability to kind of like code switch, the ability to sort of to be mobile, were beginning to be not just kind of like nice to haves. It's like these are the things, because the world is uncertain. So in other words, employability starts to be this much more sort of interesting goal, this much more interesting conversation that doesn't necessarily trigger or press the buttons around the narrowing effect as we have got used to it, I think, over the last 20 years.
Yeah, it becomes incredibly pragmatic, doesn't it? It is about how you mobilize what you know or what you can find in response to a specific situation. So often you only know what you know when you talk to someone or when you're confronted with a situation. So if you take that into an employment context, then often you do only know what you know when you're confronted with a workplace problem. So I think, as you say, Phil, this is employability here starts to become very crunchy and very pragmatic in many ways.
Yeah, it starts to become about what it is to be alive,
Yeah,
as well. But better than that, it's what it means to be confident in circumstances that are unpredictable, uncertain, and imperfect. And I think that all of that is key, really. So
we also, through this work, have been doing a lot of thinking around what's happening to knowledge at the moment. And if you've been involved in education, you might be familiar with these terms, declarative and functioning. So declarative knowledge is knowledge that we can just talk about or share or present. But functioning knowledge is our ability to actually use knowledge to do something. And often when we're designing learning experiences, particularly formal learning, we're often looking for learners to display functioning knowledge, how they use it. But often it's very easy to fall into the trap of just assessing declarative knowledge. But the reason this becomes very important is because of what AI is now doing to knowledge, the ability to produce knowledge that is very robust, often very, very believable, very lucid, very well written. If we take that ability to look at knowledge that can easily be read or shared, it only gets you so far, particularly in terms of employability. What's increasingly important is what you do with that knowledge and how you apply it to a situation, which is this idea of functioning knowledge. So we plugged this in to the work that we were doing and tried to come up with a kind of a spectrum where at the lower end we have characteristics of declarative knowledge, so things like defining concepts, summarizing things, or using formulas or applying grammatical rules, so sort of stuff that technology AI can do very well. But as you go further to the right of this spectrum towards more functioning knowledge, we start to get into more higher level metacognitive activities such as synthesis, as we mentioned earlier, this idea of interdisciplinarity, working at the intersection of disciplines, and right at the top, ideas of ethical reasoning and decision making. So even if you have all of this information, how do you make an informed ethical decision with it? So, and up the top end here, AI is less able to have as much of an impact because these are intrinsically human attributes. So in this lower end with declarative knowledge, this is really backed up by quite a lot of research. And again, I won't read all of this, but there are some key things. So surveys that found that 89% of employers believe graduates have sufficient theoretical knowledge. Only 65% believe that they could apply it in workplace context. So it's great. They come out of their degree, they have a load of knowledge, and it's sort of like, yeah, so what? That's what I was expecting them to have anyway. What I want you to do is use that.
Yeah, I mean, the point I just want to quickly make there is it makes me laugh sometimes when if you talk to a lot of employers, as we have done, and you sort of, in a bright-eyed way, sort of get very excited about, the project of university, and it's like they go, yeah, well, their base expectation is that university is delivering on subject specificity. It's not like special. It doesn't care that you got a first in photography or architecture or bioscience, whatever. That's the job. That's the baseline. So it's a bit like, declarative knowledge, or kind of the ability to sort of like put an essay together, or sort of, the ability to sort of like get your ducks in a row. It's like whatever. It's kind of like a non-bauble in that sense. And so that is why there is this sort of interesting, it can feel, I think, as if everyone's getting it wrong and there's no love in the room. But I think it's simply because the idea is that universities are expected to do this bit of the work. It's not special. It is a flat line. It is not a measurement. It is it's a given. And so I think the data here and the stats are that, it's not that declarative knowledge isn't important, because of course it is kind of like the ballast on which human behavior and sort of knowledge lives, etc., etc. But it's also it's like and I think that's just an interesting sort of distinction to make, that it but so what.
But if we get up to the other end of the scale, the more functioning knowledge ends, of complex problem solving, creative synthesis, we start to be able to plug these in to these, or see the relationship between these and these higher level target attributes for 21st century learners. So agility, if you're confronted with complex problem solving, you need agility in response. Creative synthesis involves innovation in how you bring information together in new and creative ways to solve problems. So holistic problem solving becomes important. And at the very top, this idea of principled action is about making ethical decisions, ethical reasoning and decision making. So these 21st century attributes really align with what's happening to knowledge as AI starts to sort of eat these lower level declarative knowledge.
And to be completely functioning knowledge isn't this is not we're not on the road to Damascus here. I mean, functioning knowledge is like a thing, but what it's to do with the cadence, it's to do with the rhyming scheme. It's almost like being returned to the thing that was always important. And just like COVID, and I think just like AI, I think we get terribly caught up in the idea that something new is happening. And actually, the way I see it is that AI is just another solvent that's being applied to the crud that's falling away to reveal the thing that was always there. it's not building something up. It is uncovering something that was always true. And so this little diagram here, this is just about those cadences, which is you start to see that if these four core attributes are born out of what it means to be human and what humans want from humans, really, because that's what a professional comportment is. It's like the ability for humans to interface with each other in a way that's nuanced, successful, all of those things. That if you want all of those things, then you're actually talking about the things that humans are really good at, the things that is sort of special, characteristic, and that is when you arrive in the cadence of functioning knowledge. So that they are all synonyms for one another, but it does feel like you have to go through a process of adding a solvent and clearing it back out to have a proper look to see if you've got everything, your ducks in a row. Are you producing learning experiences that are genuinely fostering functioning knowledge? Are you, or are we doing something else? And I think that's kind of the long and short of it. So yeah.
Yeah, and if we then bring this back to teaching excellence, so how does this relate to teaching excellence? Well, if we really want teaching excellence in the face of what's happening with AI and what it's doing to knowledge, then we can start to rethink teaching excellence as the practice of facilitating functioning knowledge through exceptional instructional methods, deep subject knowledge, and transformative educational experiences. So we start to get to an evolved definition of teaching excellence that is really creating opportunities for students to learn functioning knowledge, to do these things, to make ethical decisions, to work across disciplines, to synthesize information, and to solve complex problems holistically. And those things will produce employability, which is this capacity to adapt and apply knowledge in variable contexts. So
exactly.
there is this through line.
It's not like, oh God, and now we've got to do the employability bit, everyone. It's like, oh no, there I was teaching like my course, and now I've got to do employability. Oh yikes, I'll do a LinkedIn workshop and a CV session. It's like, no, that's completely not what the ambition or goal or vision of delivering employability is. Because if you plug it in this way, you start to realize that employability is a synonym for the ability to thrive in uncertain workplaces. And I'm telling you now that there is, there are no workplaces that aren't going to change and shrug you off in different and unusual ways. So that ability to sort of have confidence in yourself as employable has never been more important. And I think that's about building confidences around this idea of the knowledge we value and how we can leverage it successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. Ooh, let's go back one. Okay, so there is a clear pattern here, this idea of graduates possessing sufficient theoretical knowledge but struggling to apply it effectively. But if we do start to rethink teaching excellence around functioning knowledge, we can make a difference to this gap. And again, it isn't that people aren't trying hard to do this, but I think AI is just accelerating this need to rethink teaching excellence. And it absolutely isn't about doing more or teaching more. It's rethinking what we mean by teaching excellence and what we're actually trying to produce through high quality teaching. So this is where we get into a sort of a rethinking of what we mean by teaching excellence. So again, it's this idea, it is about the courage to teach less. We're absolutely not saying that teaching excellence involves teaching more. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about rethinking what we mean by teaching in the face of an accelerated approach to knowledge. So if we can stop thinking about teaching as delivering content, but actually about teaching as creating space to apply knowledge in scenarios, then we can start to create these conditions where we are producing the ability for students to strengthen their functioning knowledge and their ability to apply what they know to solve complex problems. But this does mean doing things like designing juxtapositions between declarative knowledge and practice. And it's not about content, it's about scenarios. It's about moving away from teaching as transmission towards teaching as facilitating activities. We saw this in COVID. We saw that the problems with delivering content, but this is now becoming even more apparent in the face of AI. There's no point in just unloading content on students, because I can get content anywhere. They can get content anywhere, and it's often very high quality content. What's really important is what they do with that and how we help them do interesting things with that and how we check that they can actually do things with that. So we start to get into reconceptions of teaching excellence and the link with assessment. But the key thing here is how we start to create this interface between what students know and what they can do. And we did a little bit of work around this idea of juxtaposition. using a filmic effect called the Kuleshov effect. And if you're interested in this, we'll talk a little bit about it now, but we did do a whole webinar on that. So do check out our previous webinar on the Kuleshov effect, because it's about this idea of how meaning emerges from when information meets context.
Well, there's a slide here, I think, coming up. So yeah, any of the, we won't go on for very long. The Kuleshov effect is an effect observed in terms of editing, essentially when different bits of information are brought together. And this, the point is, it's like where meaning lives. And in the experiment, this idea is that you had a shot A, which is the image of the impassive face of the guy, and then that was juxtaposed with an image of a bowl of soup in that top instance. And the experiment showed that audiences intuited that the look on the man's face, that the man must be hungry. The man must be hungry because of the relationship between the shot A and shot B, and that principle of meaning existing not in shot A and not in shot B, but being kind of in the sort of the chemical reaction or the alchemy in the spaces in between, in the negative space, is something that well, filmmakers surely understand it, editors understand it, but the Kuleshov effect, as we've taken it to, we've sort of extended it to be an expression of like how when you're thinking about teaching, that you're a steward of the gaps. That if you think of yourself as a steward of the gap, and that's the thing that you're trying to produce, that is the where your student and their learning lives. It's not in the content; it's in the gaps that you leave. That's where it takes place. And just as a sort of a coda to that, as opposed to you just thinking this is just some best practice nonsense that we pulled out of the sky. One of our big projects was working with a startup, and the whole goal of closing the gap for them between the learners they had and the learners the employers wanted was all about producing more gaps, more scenarios. It was to drop the kind of what is and produce more what if. So what that meant in practical terms was giving students some knowledge and some principles and some tactics, and then hitting them with curveballs, producing turbulence, uncertainty, imperfect conditions. And it was in those imperfect conditions that they had not been prepared for that they suddenly felt the musculature of their knowledge come into being. And so we worked in that we used the Kuleshov effect and juxtaposition as a defining feature of the learning design, and we ran it through as a cadence through the entire project, to very satisfying effect in terms of moving the needle around employability and producing those professional comportments that were so requested and asked for.
Yeah, and this is a good example of what we were saying earlier. This whole course was predicated on the problem that data analysts were graduating from 3-year, 4-year computer science degrees, and they had lots of knowledge of data analysis. Great. Could they work and apply that in a business context? Often not. So this course was entirely designed to help them take their often deep knowledge of data analysis, but confront them with real world experiences of working in a data team in a large organization. And only then, when their knowledge met that situation, were they able to develop some of those muscles, as you're saying, Phil, around, well, how are you going to respond to that? You've got an hour, you need to produce this, you can't do everything, I just need this answer. And suddenly they were able to, they met the constraints that they were going to face in the workplace, and it started to prepare them to think differently and behave differently and work differently.
And of course, the caveat there is that these were scenarios that were predicated entirely upon real world scenarios, but these were sort of safe spaces for mistake making and for failure and for conflict, because it was carefully calibrated inside of the learning experience. So this wasn't sort of like in the deep end and drown, because of course because the people running and designing these learning experiences had the experience to onboard people and to sort of ensure that that was understood. So I think people sometimes worry about the diversity and the inclusivity elements of sort of producing more space and producing more uncertainty. But I would much rather that we all put our minds to solving that issue than removing the spaces. That's a much better use of our teaching excellence, I think, to sort of think about how we can make that work.
Yeah. So we come back to this idea of teaching excellence and what it actually requires. And there's a filmic device called the MacGuffin, where it's a plot device which actually produces an impact in the learning experience, but it hasn't in the viewing experience, but it actually isn't the real purpose. And we found this to be really useful in understanding what's actually going on with teaching broadly in higher education, and when you start to look at the discipline and what students actually need to learn. And there's a phrase often used around learning design, which is the hidden curriculum. So we think we're learning about data analysis, but actually what we want students to learn is how to be useful data analysts, and that's a very different set often of behaviors and professional comportments. These unspoken interactions, cultural norms, the ability to work effectively within a particular environment and meet or work within constraints. So this idea of the hidden curriculum is something that comes up in every project that we've done. We're often told or given a brief as to this is what we want, and the first piece of work is to excavate what the client actually wants, what's actually going to solve the problem, and often it isn't the thing necessarily that they're asking for. So
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, for those people who aren't completely familiar with the MacGuffin, we're just going. The next slide, I think, is just a very quick example of it, just to show you that in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, there's some money that's stolen, and you think that the money is important, but as Hitchcock himself said of MacGuffins, that they're important to the plot but not to the story. The story of Psycho is about a bunch of other things. It's a much more multi-dimensional, nuanced psychoanalytical, it's a Freudian study of character interplay. It is not about an embezzlement. It's not about money. And we use the MacGuffin to sort of as a provocation for some, which is that whenever we've been called in by clients to make particular projects about a subject, all of the conversation almost immediately falls to all of the things outside of the subject specificity. We're not talking about data, actually. We're talking about business acumen. Well, sorry, business acumen is an entirely different curricula to data. It's like so. But in order for data analysis to become useful and valuable and drive change, these people need this other thing. And if you've got this other thing, you need this other thing called conflict resolution skills, because actually and so it goes on. And you suddenly realize that data analysis, the idea that that's the curriculum, that's a MacGuffin. It's important because it's the framework, but it is not the story of that educational experience. It will not deliver on those core attributes alone. So this notion that subject specificity is a MacGuffin, it is important, but it is not as important as people who love their subject often position it as. And it is one of the barriers to successful learning experiences that we have encountered, this idea that subject specificity is the point of that educational experience. So
yeah, I guess to the heart of teaching excellence, because if you think that the discipline is important or the most important thing, you will end up teaching the discipline, and you will end up designing learning that enables you to teach the discipline. But actually, if you recognize that the discipline is often the front door to what's actually important or what's actually being asked for, then you will design the door, you'll design the gaps, you'll design the space that you walk into. You won't design just the door, because it's not just about the door.
So I think we have a handy visual aid here. So yeah, this is a famous optical illusion, which we tend to use a lot just because we like pictures and because it's easy. So the first, you look at this famous optical illusion, and the first thing I think that most people see immediately is the vase. It takes a moment of sort of cognitive dissonance and pause to recognize that the vase is in fact being pressed into kind of perception by the profile of those two faces. So it's like a negative space versus kind of like, so, and we use this a lot when we're trying to sort of like surface and talk about the stuff that people aren't talking about, the stuff that is hugely important in a learning experience, but the subject matter expert or the practitioners themselves are not talking to it because they are about the vase. And so here you have that notion that the declarative knowledge, which we're taking to mean here, to be the ballast, to be kind of like the things that make a discipline the discipline. So if you're a photographer, it's like f-stops, or if you're a scientist, it's about, I don't know, it's about chemical components and structures. It's those things. But those things, you can find that knowledge easily now. And AI, I think we've comforted ourselves for a while that AI hallucinates, which it still does. It's not great. It's getting better all the time. The idea of the reliability of AI to deliver declarative knowledge, that is its mission. It's improving. All of the AI apps that we're familiar with now have a new review. button, which produces a moment of pause, so it can actually check its own credibility and its reliability. It's being worked on as we speak. The vase is the thing that AI can do. AI can throw a vase, no problem, and it's going to get better and better and better. However, what we know, and when we talk with clients, is that the vase is like, duh, so what? You come from university holding a vase. That's the basic expectation. So what? You realise that there's all this huge conversation that's richer and actually, more human, that lives in that negative space around it. And I think that teaching excellence often requires recognising that subject content is the MacGuffin. It draws the eye. It's where you go first. It's what you look at first. It's what you can get your hands around. It's what you think is really important. If that were the case, if that were truly true, then that causation between teaching excellence and employability would be like that. It would be hand in glove, and it's not hand in glove, and it's not been hand in glove for forever. And I think that there's only a limited number of times that we can keep looking at that data and not deciding to make some structural changes. Really.
Yeah, agreed. So yeah, just to sum that up, so teaching excellence requires more than subject knowledge, and we argue that it demands creating meaningful learning communities. Now you might be thinking, well, that's quite a big leap from subject knowledge to learning communities, but the idea is, when you are trying to produce effective learning, if you're trying to close the employability gap, the skills gap, produce employable graduates, we need to be thinking about spaces where different perspectives interact, because that is where your knowledge is tested, when it is mobilized, when it comes into interaction with people and things and experiences and activities that are part of a learning experience that live outside of the content often. It's about integrating extracurricular activities where we deliberately bring in information from outside the discipline. So it helps us press that disciplinary knowledge into formation. But this idea that this approach to community leadership is about developing the capabilities for functioning knowledge. It is about enabling people, enabling learners, students, professionals, whatever level, to really think about how they apply their knowledge in a given context. And
this is the provocation, I think, Tony, isn't it? It's the provocation, because I certainly know that when I was a course leader, and I'm not suggesting that I was sort of like ahead of the game, it was just about something that I'd understood to be important, is that a lot of my colleagues thought I was mad because I would give energy and time and like learning design capacity to the spaces outside of my course. So the community part of it. Now, that wasn't because I wanted us all to sort of, to hug. It was because I understood that there was something that I could convene or curate. I could produce a kind of a gap. In other words, there were gaps around the subject specificity, and those gaps were online. They were also sort of in corridors. They were in base rooms. And I think everyone knows all of this stuff. But I've always felt that, how do you argue for those things sort of robustly from a sort of a pedagogy and a learning design point of view? Well, I think if you look at the logic of functioning knowledge and that employability gap, about how people need their corners knocked off, if you like, for that professional comportment, that people need to sort of be interdisciplinary, not in because they've done one project where they've kind of like worked with a student from another course, but where they've got the fluency and the agility and the confidence to sort of see themselves in completely different sectors, all of that stuff, the ability to sort of pivot. If you hear all of that now, how many people are being made redundant? Loads of people. Pivot, reframing, reinvention. Those, if we believe, as I do, that they are 21st century attributes, because that level of unpredictability, that level of imperfection around stability around your sector is absolutely the lived experience of most people, then you can leverage the power of community, with a small c, with a big C. And the idea that now, as a teacher, as an educator, you are in charge of those spaces too. That might be like, oh, really? But my experience of it certainly was that it was incredibly powerful, and the efficacy of taking responsibility and designing into those gaps was its own reward, because it produced so many positive effects. So yeah.
And I've just popped a little link in the chat there to Ding's guide, handy guide to creating learning communities. So if you want to explore that idea in more detail, do check out the slides and the guide that we've just popped in the chat there.
But these guidances were born out of sort of a post-COVID space where about sort of leveraging online communities. But much of the insights and sort of the caveats, all of those things apply generally to this notion that you're trying to produce spaces where the learning is social, where it's free range, and you're producing kind of collision and turbulence and difference. But you are in charge of that, and there's more that you can do to produce those conditions. And I think that's a strand of teaching excellence that perhaps that is a provocation, because it's like it's not about the subject at all. It's not about, you know, in that sense.
That's it. And I think there is it's an interesting situation where many people are employed based on their subject knowledge. You're employed to be a teacher based on your subject knowledge, and therefore you feel compelled to teach your subject. And actually, excellent teaching increasingly is not about teaching your subject. It is about facilitating interaction and communities in the gaps between your subject, you know, because your students can learn about your subject
Anywhere.
from you, but anywhere. So if you're going to teach that subject, it's the bits in between the subject that will really move the needle in terms of what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to help your students learn that subject, but also apply it, then excellent teaching, it involves not just teaching the subject, it involves facilitating the interactions between people, content, activities, and producing those regular juxtapositions, that uncertainty, in a safe space where students can really learn to apply those new skills.
Yeah.
There's our guide in the chat. So really, just to sum up, so this is about questioning practices, as we were saying. So, and it is about challenging some of these accepted customs, particularly in formal learning and higher education, that amazingly still persist a lot. This idea of lectures, and both you and I have said we're not anti-lecture at all. If it's the right mode for a given situation, then great. But customs of duration, just to fill periods of time because it's always been done like that, is a problem, because that is absolutely not flexible, and it's not reacting to the realities of uncertainty or how things change.
I mean, the problem here is not the hour-long lecture; it's the hour-long. Because when you think about timetabling, one of the quick sort of comparisons I want to make is that we've necessarily, because we've left quite a sort of a regulated sort of the cadences of higher education are very established, you know, very, very established. And we've had to work in spaces that are operating differently, more quickly, more accelerated. And that's illuminated in two directions. But what I'm minded to talk about is the Netflix model, which is that you know, when you look sort of traditional broadcast, TV had to be an hour long or half an hour long to meet sort of the commercial you know, advertisers, or because of when the 9 o'clock news was. And then you look now at sort of Netflix, and like you've got a long form TV show, and one episode might be 38 minutes, another episode might be, I don't know, an hour, because that's what it needs to be to deliver on the purposes and the goals and the cadences of that episode. And I looked to that model there. I looked at that there because I think that's a shift there about why do we use duration the way that we do, and we've certainly had to think and question our own relationships to duration. And you think, oh, is it because, you know, there's all this orthodoxy in learning design, you know, in best practice about, well, a thing can only be 10 minutes, or a video can only be 3 minutes, or you need a call to action every 5 minutes, or it's not working. Tony and I have no truck with that. The question is what is your intention, and what is the duration that will deliver upon the learning experience that you're seeking to produce? And I actually think that you are looking at teaching excellence is about taking on structural folklore, customs of duration. I think it's so important that is on your agenda. I think in terms of if you're going to produce these more turbulent, imperfect, if you're going to make more space, if you're going to make things more experiential, duration is the thing you're going to have to address. Because if you're still trying to squidge it into an hour just because an hour might be perfect, but if you're squidging it in there for reasons that you don't remember, then I think you've got an opportunity there to do some structural change. And I think that would be truly excellent teaching in that sense. So
Yeah, very much so. And I think it is a reason why higher education at the moment is struggling to adapt, because there are these very fixed structures that are very embedded in the culture and the customs of higher education. But that, as Netflix has done with television, they are customs that need challenging and questioning as knowledge evolves, and the acquisition of knowledge changes, and we need to think much more clearly about why those structures exist and how they might be changed to produce the effects that we're actually asking for.
Exactly. Don't get me wrong. I'm a fan of a very long. If Kubrick's 2001 is a very long, very slow film, and it's very long and very slow for very good reasons.
Good reasons, yeah.
From a learning design perspective, it's the perfect vehicle for its message. So I think I don't want anyone to misunderstand that this is about demonstrating teaching excellence equates to new orthodoxies of duration, or it's about the effects that you are trying to produce. If you are trying to produce and foster functioning knowledge, that's the only answer. That's the only question that you should be seeking to answer, and your answers will live in your discipline, and they will live in your constraints. They will live in your institution. But they're the right questions to be asking now. I think choosing the right question to answer has never been more important, I think.
No, absolutely not. And so this brings us to a conclusion around another provocation of sort of rethinking of this idea of teaching excellence. So we argue that if you rethink teaching excellence as follows, you can start to actually achieve what you're asking for. So we think teaching excellence is the practice of facilitating learning experiences that transform knowledge into capability through the intentional design of activity, context, and community. And if you do that, you can develop graduates who can effectively navigate and shape uncertain futures. But this key thing here is this intentional design of activity, context, and community. It's not leaving it to chance. It's not just doing it the same way because that's always how it's been done. It's about thinking very intentionally, very purposefully about what is happening, why it's happening, when it's happening, who it's happening with, on what platforms it's happening. Is it in person? Is it online? And what effects? And how does the sum total of all of that activity produce the effects that you're looking for?
And finally, for me, I want to say this: if, like me, it's hard not to feel political, not to feel sort of activated by some of the sort of the narrowing effects of language around education in this project. For me, when I look at this definition, there is something here that means that there is a fight to be had, right? And the fight is in that last idea of that what you're really doing is developing graduates for uncertain futures. We know that sort of the graduate destination metrics, all of those things present a view that student satisfaction and the efficacy of your program, all of those things align with reducing uncertainty, with a kind of a bedtime story about the employment market, a bedtime story, a story that might have been true 50 years ago. It might have been true 50 years ago that there's a linear and safe progression through the haunted wood towards kind of mortgage land and all of those things. But we know that's not true. We know that it's uncertain out there, and we know that the world is more complicated, more interdisciplinary, more intersectional. It's absolutely more cubist and more dimensional than ever before. And I actually think that you can use that reality not as tragedy, not as stress, but you can pull that through into a program and start to rebuild confident, creative, robust young people, or people to meet that in interesting and challenging and disruptive ways. To me, that still feels like professional comportment and employability to me. I don't think that there's a contradiction. I think that to deliver on employability is to deliver on human capacity and confidence. And it is that refusal of tragedy, uncertainty as tragedy, uncertainty as your course has failed, or that it is not those things. It is what the world looks like. It's looked like it for a long time. For me, there's an ambition there around why all of this matters and why teaching excellence needs to move towards the truth of what it means to leave university or an institution and meet the world as it truly is, and to meet the workplace in all of its imperfect ways, and to meet human beings with all of their lumps and bumps and corners. I just think that is the job that we should be doing.
Yeah, and like, as you say, Phil, that this when you view teaching excellence like that, it starts to feel like a very exciting project. It starts to feel absolutely not like a neoliberal narrowing of education,
Yeah.
and it starts to feel like the work that we absolutely should be doing.
Because if we're not doing it, then we are turning HE into a bedtime story. Um, you know, that would be my sort of final provocation. Yeah.
If you've enjoyed this, well, thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful. And if you'd like more nourishing morsels from the Ding team, check out our website, ding.global, and our blog. And if you'd like to drop us a line, then get in touch by email, hello@ding.global, or just visit our website and you can book in a time to chat with us using a QR code on there. But we're always happy to chat about any of the issues raised here or anything that you'd like to talk about to do with teaching, learning, assessment, learning design, the future of AI, the world, inclusivity, and broadly anything that has anything possibly to do with education and learning at all.
And houseplants.
And houseplants. Yeah. Check out our webinar on North Facing Gardens if you want more on houseplants. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you, Phil, for a very insightful